let's talk about this really interesting discovery of a very strange white dwarf that seems to contain unusual signs of ancient planet on its surface. Or to be more specific, it actually seems to contain tiny remnants that collided with the white dwarf, producing almost like a scar visible on the surface. But what's even more intriguing about the discovery is how all of this was delivered to this white dwarf and what exactly crashed with it to produce these unusual observations. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton. Let's discuss this new discovery a little bit more, focusing on why it's actually so unusual, but also talk about what's happening here and why this is kind of important. But first, a super quick reminder. White dwarfs are technically not stars. They're star remnants. They're basically what our sun and a lot of other similar stars become at the end of their lifetimes. And unlike stars, they're mostly made out of what's known as degenerate matter, and to be more exact, electron degenerate matter, essentially forming an extremely dense ocean of electrons size of planet Earth with a mass of the sun. And intriguingly, some of the first white dwarfs discovered that were actually found over 100 years ago had these very strange observations that didn't make sense at first. One of them was known as Van Manen 2, named after Adrian van Manen, a Dutch-American astronomer who found it in 1917. You can sort of see it right there as a black dot. And here initial observations revealed unusual signs of iron, calcium, magnesium, and a few other heavier compounds inside the atmosphere of this somewhat small star. And though back then it wasn't clear exactly why this was happening, eventually researchers realized that this was actually the first sign ever, or the first evidence ever, of ancient planets around an ancient star. In other words, the signs of first exoplanets were technically discovered back in 1917, but it wasn't until later, much later, that the scientists actually understood what all of these elements in the star's atmosphere meant. In this case, this white dwarf was basically polluted. Or in other words, it contained materials from elsewhere, very likely one of its planets, which then, for one reason or another, got completely destroyed through tidal forces and eventually collided with the surface of the planet, with many of the elements then remaining in the white dwarf's atmosphere. And since then, quite a lot of different types of pollution has been observed in many different white dwarfs. For example, we know that any nitrogen in the white dwarf's atmosphere very likely comes from cometary objects, whereas things like lithium most likely comes from the crust of various terrestrial planets. And anywhere from 20 to 50% of all white dwarfs seem to contain signs of pollution. Or basically up to 50% of all white dwarfs out there very likely had some kind of a leftover around them, possibly a planet, maybe a bunch of asteroids, or maybe some comets, that eventually collided with the surface. And so this seems to be a relatively common and a somewhat universal phenomenon. On top of this, approximately 1 to maybe 4% of white dwarfs also contain optically thick debris disks, like the one you see right here. And these are also formed through tidal disruption of much larger objects, usually planets or planetary leftovers, that were orbiting relatively close. But a handful of white dwarfs also contain actual planets, and we've discussed some of them in videos you can find in the description. And so basically, discovering these polluted white dwarfs, and white dwarfs contaminated or polluted by something else coming from another object, is actually surprisingly common. But in this case, this white dwarf was a little bit unusual. Okay, not at first, but after a much more thorough analysis. And so once again here, the researchers identified remnants somewhere on its surface. So here we had signs of calcium, magnesium, and iron once again. But in this case, this wasn't just a single observation, it was actually several different shots over a much longer period, which revealed something really strange. The materials on the surface of this white dwarf, WD0816-310, all seem to be concentrated in a single spot. But more importantly, the strength of the elemental signal was actually changing as the star rotated, basically implying that this was something right on its surface, as if something slammed into the surface, leaving a kind of a scar, a metal scar in this case. And so all of these metals were now localized to a very specific region that would only become visible once the white dwarf rotated its face toward us. And the scar itself contained a lot of different stuff. There was quite a lot of sodium, there was a lot of chromium, a lot of nickel, suggesting that all of this came from some kind of a terrestrial object. And based on the observations of the amount of this stuff, the researchers were even able to figure out how big this object was. And it probably wasn't that big. possibly similar to Vesta, approximately 500 kilometers in size. So essentially a really large asteroid, or possibly some kind of a dwarf planet. But a dwarf planet or an asteroid containing predominantly terrestrial materials. And because generally a lot of these heavier elements should have already sunk into the white dwarf since they're much heavier, in this case this pollution on the surface suggests that this was actually somewhat recent. Now not like yesterday, but possibly within the last few thousands of years. Or maybe even much earlier. But here the researchers also wanted to answer one important question. How exactly do these objects fall onto the white dwarf? Because it's unlikely to happen similar to planet Earth. It's not just going to collide this way. Since this is a much more massive and a much more dense object, and because it also contains an extremely powerful magnetosphere, all of this must play a role. And so here they analyzed the magnetic field of the white dwarf in order to see if there are any connections. Turns out the magnetosphere plays a really important role in producing these unusual scars. Here, the orientation of this metallic scar was directly synchronized or correlated with the strength of the white dwarf's magnetic field, which implied one thing. It implied that all of these elements, as they were being deposited on the surface, followed the magnetic lines, kind of similar to what we usually observe during the aurora on planet Earth. And so this simulation from NASA kind of shows us what happens. But here we're only talking about charged particles such as hydrogen and essentially tiny atoms. This is of course the result of powerful solar activity interacting with Earth's magnetosphere. But something on a much larger scale seems to happen around the white dwarf. Except that it's not just tiny charged particles. Here we're talking about entire chunks of material coming from a large asteroid, which was very likely shredded by the tidal effects. And so here all of this material was then deposited following the magnetic lines, with the highest concentration being extremely close to the magnetic poles. So essentially it's a kind of a funneling effect, which could also be universal and potentially applies to a lot of similar objects, because we do expect all of them to have very similar properties. But one of the reasons we've never seen this before is really because previously the researchers only took a couple of snapshots and have never really seen changes in time like they did this time. And so in this case, by taking multiple observations over many years, we'll probably find very similar properties around most polluted white dwarfs. Or at least that's what the researchers expect. But because this is a brand new discovery, at least for now we're just going to assume that maybe this is just the only white dwarf with these very strange properties. And so it will probably take a few months and possibly a few years to confirm this around other objects as well. But until those confirmations, or until more discoveries of other strange white dwarfs, that's all I wanted to mention. Check out some of the previous videos with very similar exciting discoveries from various white dwarfs in one of the videos in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon by joining channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.